June 15, 2023. It was supposed to be a day of joy, one full of laughter and celebration. Chad Dorman, a father in Monroe Township, Ohio, was preparing for his children's birthday party. But just hours before the cake was to be cut, a shocking act of violence would shatter the lives of everyone who knew them. His three sons, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, were executed in cold blood, and their mother, Laura, was left fighting for her life. What drove a father to commit such an unimaginable crime? How could someone entrusted with the care of innocent children, the very ones he had promised to protect, carry out this brutal act? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling details behind one of Ohio's most heartbreaking crimes. Chad Dorman, a 32-year-old father, lived with his wife, Laura, and their three young children in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Monroe Township, Ohio. To most people, the Dormans were just another family, living a typical middle-class American life. Chad, a man of few words, was seen as a reserved individual, polite but distant. His wife, Laura, a 30-year-old mother, was warm and nurturing, always putting her children first. Clayton, their eldest son, was 7 years old, full of energy, curiosity, and the kind of innocence that only a child could possess. Hunter, at just 4, was sweet and playful, always running around with a smile that could brighten anyone's day. And then there was Chase, the youngest, a lively 3-year-old whose laughter filled their home with joy. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly ordinary, almost idyllic. The family had their ups and downs, like any other, but nothing that would have raised any alarm bells. Chad and Laura seemed to be a couple that, despite the occasional bumps in the road, had created a life filled with love for their children and a sense of stability. Monroe Township, a small community in southwestern Ohio, was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, children played in front yards, and the pace of life moved at a gentle rhythm. This was a neighborhood where you could leave your front door open and not worry about what might happen. It was a place where tragedy seemed like a foreign concept, but beneath this calm and seemingly idyllic existence, there were subtle signs that something wasn't right. Chad's demeanor had begun to change in the days leading up to June 15, 2023. He had always been quiet, but over the past few weeks, he had grown more withdrawn. His behavior had become increasingly unpredictable, his moods darker and more erratic. Laura, who knew him better than anyone, started noticing small things that worried her. He would become distant, saying less, almost as if he was lost in his thoughts. At times he seemed agitated for no clear reason, speaking in strange, disjointed sentences. Laura attributed these changes to stress, perhaps the pressures of work or the stresses of family life, but deep down she began to wonder if something more was going on. She was no stranger to the ups and downs of marriage, having been with Chad for years. They had their challenges, like every couple, but they were a family. They had built a life together. But something about Chad's behavior was different now. Laura tried to reason with him, but his responses were odd. On the morning of June 15th, she felt a sense of unease that she couldn't shake off. The tension in their home was palpable, yet there was no clear reason why. She brushed it off at first, telling herself that it was probably just stress. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon, on June 15, 2023, in the small, quiet town of Monroe Township, Ohio. Chad Dorman, a father of 3, was getting ready for what should have been a joyous occasion, his children's birthday party. Clayton, Hunter, and Chase were excited, full of energy, eager to celebrate their special day. But no one could have predicted that the excitement of a birthday celebration would be replaced by the harrowing echoes of a crime that would forever alter their family, their community, and everyone who knew them. In the hours leading up to the tragedy, a sense of unease had begun to build. Chad, who had always been a quiet and sometimes distant figure, started acting strangely. He wandered around the house, muttering to himself in ways that unsettled his wife, Laura. At first she tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was stressed or dealing with something internal. But there was something in the way he carried himself that set off alarm bells in Laura's mind. Laura later recalled a moment that chilled her to the core. As the family sat down to have lunch, Chad spoke in a way that made her uneasy. He looked at her and said, "This will be my last good meal." The words seemed off, like a dark, cryptic warning she couldn't quite understand. But Laura, trying to stay calm, reassured him that everything was fine. She tried to keep the atmosphere light, even as the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Chad had always been unpredictable, but this was different. This was more than just a bad mood or a passing phase. Something was off in his eyes, in the way he moved, in the things he said. Laura's mind raced, and in a moment of desperate clarity, she decided to confront him. She told Chad she was going to call his parents. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't shake the feeling that danger was close. But Chad's response to her concern was eerily calm. He assured her it was nothing. He was just going through something, but everything was fine. "I'm just kidding," he said, trying to dismiss her fear. But there was no reassuring her this time. Laura knew something was wrong. She stood there trying to decide what to do next. And just as quickly as he had calmed her, Chad made an unexpected move. He walked into the room where his gun was stored. It wasn't something he had done before. Chad had always been an isolated man, but never violent, or so Laura thought. He opened the safe, retrieved a rifle, and suddenly, everything shifted. The once quiet, distant man she knew was now someone else entirely. Laura's heart sank as she watched him, but before she could react, the unimaginable happened. Chad aimed the rifle at their son, Clayton, only 7 years old. Clayton had no warning, no chance to flee. He was shot. In the heart of their home, in his own bedroom, Clayton's life was taken in an instant. The horror didn't stop there. Hunter, just 4 years old, and Chase, the youngest at 3, were in the house, unaware of the terror unfolding around them. As Chad's rage turned to cold, calculated violence, he chased his 2 remaining sons through the house. The sound of their little feet running, the frantic screams for help, none of it was enough to save them. Chad closed the distance between them, and one by one he shot both of them down. Hunter, who had been so full of life, just hours before, was shot in the hallway. Chase, the baby of the family, was shot as he tried to flee near the front door. While Chad Dorman's 3 children lost their lives that day, the nightmare was not over for everyone. There was one survivor, Laura Dorman, the mother of the victims, and the wife of the man who committed the unspeakable act. But Laura's survival came at an unimaginable cost. Laura had been in the home when the horrific violence erupted, and what she experienced would stay with her forever. She was a mother, a wife, someone who was supposed to be safe in her own home. But what happened that day shattered everything. According to reports from the investigation, it was clear that Laura never expected what was coming. Laura's heart raced as she witnessed the unthinkable. Her children were gone in an instant, but she couldn't stop. Despite everything she had just seen, Laura ran toward the other rooms, trying to save anyone she could. She saw Hunter and Chase, and before she could act, Chad was already there. He shot them down in front of her, leaving her helpless and broken. But what happened next was something that no one expected. Laura, severely injured but determined, somehow managed to escape. She wasn't sure how. Everything was a blur, but she fought to survive. Bloodied, battered, and emotionally shattered, she crawled out of the house, driven by the sheer will to live. Laura somehow found the strength to reach out to someone. In those final moments, Laura was able to alert her and tell her to call for help. It wasn't just an act of survival. It was an act of a mother's love, of someone doing everything in their power to protect those they love, even when facing the unimaginable. It's almost unfathomable to think of what she went through. The sheer terror of watching her children die, the hopelessness of trying to save them, and the trauma of knowing she couldn't stop it. With Laura's desperate cry for help, a call was made to 911. The call to authorities would mark the beginning of the end for Chad Dorman. It was Laura's quick thinking, her last attempt at saving what she could, that ultimately led law enforcement to the scene. But by the time they arrived, the devastation was already evident. The horrific scene they were about to encounter was one that would haunt them for years to come. Laura was found outside, barely able to stand. She had been wounded in the chaos, her body a symbol of the violence she had just survived. Deputies described the scene as one of sheer devastation. Laura, covered in blood, was rushed to the hospital. As she lay in the hospital bed, physically healing from her injuries, the emotional wounds were just beginning. While she fought to survive, Laura was also forced to come to terms with what had happened. She had lost her 3 children. Their birthdays had been meant to be a time of joy, but instead they would forever be a reminder of a day that tore her world apart. Laura's trauma didn't end when the physical healing began. The emotional scars, the haunting memories of what she saw, would remain with her for the rest of her life. For weeks after the attack, Laura struggled to find any sense of normalcy. She was in constant pain, both physical and emotional. She had lost her children, and the man she had once loved was now the monster who had taken everything from her. The question of why weighed heavily on her, as it did for the entire community. What had happened to Chad? How could someone she had once trusted with her life become capable of such violence? Despite the darkness, Laura's resilience was undeniable. Even in the face of unimaginable loss, she became a symbol of survival, of strength in the most crushing circumstances. But no amount of strength could erase what had happened. The journey of healing, both physical and emotional, would be a long and painful one. Laura would never be the same again. The world would remember her as the mother who fought to survive, who fought for one last chance to save her children. But in the quiet moments, in the silence that followed, she would also be the woman who had witnessed her children's final breaths, and no amount of time could change that. As the first deputies arrived at the scene, the horror of the crime was immediately apparent. The air was heavy, filled with a sense of disbelief, as they stepped onto the property. What had been a day set aside for celebration, for laughter and joy, had quickly turned into something unthinkable. The house, once filled with the anticipation of a birthday party, now stood still, silent, haunted by its own tragedy. The sound of sirens cut through the air, but the neighborhood was eerily quiet as investigators moved in to process the crime scene. Outside, Chad Dorman sat motionless on his front porch, rifle in hand. His expression was vacant, his posture eerily calm, as though he had already come to terms with the magnitude of what had happened. There was no resistance when officers approached. They found him almost detached, as if he were merely waiting for them. The scene was jarring. A father who had just moments before executed his 3 children was now sitting passively, almost as if nothing had occurred. The deputies didn't waste any time. They immediately moved to secure the house, knowing that every moment mattered. Inside, they found the victims, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, 3 brothers, each so young and full of life, now cold and lifeless. The eldest, Clayton, just 7 years old, was found first in the master bedroom, his body lying in a way that was almost as though he had been caught off guard. Hunter, only 4 years old, was found in the hallway, and little Chase, just 3 years old, was discovered in a different part of the house. Each child had been shot at close range, their innocence taken from them in the most brutal way possible. Laura, their mother, was the only survivor. She had been shot as well, caught in the chaos of the attack, but by some twist of fate, severely wounded, she managed to crawl her way to safety. Her injuries were grave, but her survival was nothing short of a miracle. When authorities arrived at the hospital, she was able to provide them with crucial information that helped them understand what had happened inside her home. But it was too late. Her children were gone. The questions about why and how began to flood her mind, and they would soon flood the minds of investigators as well. As the investigation unfolded, the deputies began gathering evidence from inside the house. The scene was grisly. They found a .22 caliber rifle, the weapon Chad Dorman had used to kill his children, lying just outside the door where they had found him. Bloodstains led throughout the house, tracing the final horrific moments of the children's lives as they tried to escape or protect one another from their father. The sheer brutality of it all was enough to rattle even the most seasoned investigators. But it wasn't just the physical evidence that was disturbing, it was the story that began to emerge about Chad Dorman's behavior. As the police delved deeper into his background, they learned that this was not a random act of violence. This was a planned, calculated execution. Dorman had been acting erratically for some time. His wife Laura had expressed growing concerns about his behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. He had spoken in strange, cryptic ways, even claiming that this would be his last good meal, the morning of the killings. These signs weren't dismissed. They were red flags, but there had been no indication of the true horror that was about to unfold. During the initial questioning, Doorman seemed unnervingly calm. His responses were matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing an ordinary event rather than the murder of his children. He spoke about the killings in a chillingly detached manner, saying that he had been preparing for the deaths of his children, and that it had been something he had planned for some time. He even said that he was cleaning up the family, as if his actions were justified or even necessary. His coldness sent a shiver through the investigators, but as they tried to get more information, they encountered a major obstacle. Doorman's confession was ruled inadmissible. The issue lay in the way the police had read him his Miranda rights. The confession, which might have solidified the case against him, was thrown out due to a technicality, creating a significant setback for the investigation. Despite this, the evidence against him remained overwhelming. The deputies were able to construct a clear timeline of the events from various pieces of physical evidence and the testimonies they had gathered. Neighbors and friends reported that Chad had been acting strange for several weeks before the killings. He had become withdrawn, increasingly agitated, and had made bizarre statements. At one point, he had even talked about preparing for his final day. The more investigators learned about Chad's behavior, the more they understood that the murders hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment act. They were the culmination of something darker, something that had been building for a while. Domestic issues had been escalating within the household, with Laura and Chad frequently arguing. But even with this knowledge, investigators were still left with the nagging question of why. Why did he kill his children? The media soon descended on Monroe Township, adding a new layer of intensity to the case. Headlines screamed about the unimaginable crime, about a father who had taken the lives of his own sons. Local residents were left reeling, struggling to make sense of how someone they thought they knew could commit such an atrocity. Chad Doorman had been a quiet, private man. Neighbors remembered him as an unassuming father, and no one could have predicted the horror that would unfold inside his home. To understand why Chad Doorman carried out such a horrific act, we must examine the psychological state of the man behind the violence. On the surface, Chad appeared to be an ordinary father, living a seemingly normal life in Monroe Township with his wife, Laura, and their 3 young sons. But beneath that exterior, there were signs of deep unrest. Neighbors and friends later revealed that Chad had become increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to the killings. He had always been known as a quiet, reserved man. But something had changed. He exhibited behavior that raised concerns, mood swings, erratic actions, and moments of intense anger. Those who knew him described a man who was often distant, but with a simmering undercurrent of something more troubling. In the days leading up to June 15, 2023, Chad's actions became even more unsettling. His wife, Laura, recalled strange conversations and unsettling remarks. He began speaking in odd, almost cryptic ways, hinting at dark thoughts that caused her to worry. One of the last things she remembered him saying was, "This will be my last good meal." Was this a sign that he had already made up his mind about what he was about to do? Experts later speculated that Chad's mental state might have been severely impacted by a combination of factors: stress, isolation, and possibly undiagnosed mental health issues. Though he had no known history of violent behavior, it seemed as though he was on the verge of a breakdown, one that would culminate in the destruction of his family. Despite his outward appearance, Chad's psychological state may have been teetering on the edge for some time. Investigators uncovered that he had previously been treated for anxiety and depression, but he had not sought help in the months prior to the killings. Without proper care, untreated mental health issues can manifest in dangerous ways. Was it this internal battle, combined with external pressures, that ultimately pushed him over the edge? Further examination of Chad's behavior revealed alarming signs of narcissism, his need for control and dominance over his family, as well as his inability to empathize with the suffering of others. He saw himself as the center of his world, and it's possible that in his mind, the world he had created for himself had to be preserved at all costs. But why did his children, his own flesh and blood, become the targets of his rage? Was this a premeditated act of cold-blooded murder, or an impulsive explosion of frustration that escalated tragically? As investigators delved deeper into his mind, they uncovered a man who was both a victim of his own mental health struggles and a perpetrator of one of the most devastating acts of violence imaginable. As the investigation unfolded, the gravity of the situation became clearer. Doorman was officially charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder and additional charges of felonious assault for the brutal injuries inflicted on his wife, Laura. In the early stages of the case, the police released disturbing details of the crime, including Doorman's erratic behavior prior to the murders. He had been acting strangely for days, becoming increasingly disconnected and emotionally volatile. His wife, Laura, had even expressed concern about his mental state, fearing he was no longer the man she had married. But it was the final moments before the murders that truly shook everyone to their core. Doorman's chilling comment to Laura, "This will be my last good meal," was an eerie indication of the coldness that would follow. Shortly afterward, he retrieved a rifle from a hidden safe and shot their son Clayton in the bedroom, before pursuing his other 2 children, Hunter and Chase, and executing them one by one in cold blood. Laura, attempting to intervene and protect her children, was also injured, but managed to survive the horrific attack. When Doorman was arrested, his calmness was striking. The deputies who apprehended him described his behavior as detached, even in the face of such a horrifying crime. It was clear that this was no ordinary crime of passion. It was something far more calculated, more chilling. In the weeks following his arrest, as the community struggled to process the loss of such young lives, the legal proceedings began in earnest. Public interest in the case reached a fever pitch. Doorman's trial, which was initially set to be a lengthy and high-profile affair, was soon overshadowed by a plea deal that would ultimately determine his fate. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, including his confession and the details shared by law enforcement officers, Doorman's defense team fought to mitigate his charges, offering several psychological explanations for his actions, including potential mental health issues. As the legal battle progressed, the evidence stacked up against him in a way that made his defense almost untenable. The details of his erratic behavior, his unsettling remarks to family members, and the violent acts themselves were too much to ignore. The public was increasingly outraged, demanding that Doorman face the harshest penalties for his crimes. Prosecutors, determined to see justice done for the victims, pushed for the maximum sentence. In an unexpected turn, just before the trial could officially begin, a plea agreement was reached. Chad Doorman pled guilty to all charges, including 3 counts of aggravated murder, as well as the felonious assault charges related to his wife's injuries. His decision to plead guilty spared the community and surviving family members the trauma of a prolonged trial. It also spared the victims' loved ones from having to relive the harrowing details of the murders in open court. On the day of his sentencing, the courtroom was filled with a mix of emotions: anger, grief, and a sense of finality. Doorman was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never walk free again. The judge, while acknowledging the complexity of the case, made it clear that such a crime could never be justified. The sentences were a small measure of justice, but they could never bring back the lives of Clayton, Hunter, and Chase. For Laura, the surviving mother, the road ahead would be long and fraught with pain. She had lost everything in a matter of hours: the love of her life and her 3 children. While the legal proceedings had provided some closure, the emotional scars would never heal. The Doorman family had been torn apart in a way that no legal system could undo. The aftermath of the murders in Monroe Township was nothing short of devastating. What had once been a tight-knit, peaceful community was now left reeling, its sense of security shattered in the most unimaginable way. Chad Doorman, the quiet father who once walked among them, was now a figure of horror, a man who had executed his 3 young sons in cold blood, just hours before their planned birthday party. For neighbors who had shared meals, watched their children play together, and celebrated birthdays side by side, the revelation of Chad's crimes left them in stunned disbelief. How could this be the same man they had seen walking his children to school, or sitting in his yard, talking about nothing more sinister than lawn care or local events? How had he gone from seemingly ordinary to a ruthless killer? The shock was so intense, it felt as though the ground beneath their feet had been ripped away. As the days passed, the entire town was filled with whispers. Everyone was grappling with the same question: how could this happen in our own backyard? Monroe Township, a place known for its suburban calm and close community ties, had become ground zero for a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. The familiar faces of neighbors now seemed to wear expressions of disbelief, their once friendly streets now filled with an eerie silence that seemed to echo the brutality of the murders. And then came the media storm. News outlets, both local and national, quickly descended on the small town. The initial reports were nothing short of shocking. Ohio father executes his sons before their birthday party. Headlines flashed across the country as the case went viral, and every new detail that emerged seemed to deepen the mystery. The media didn't just report the crime, they sensationalized it. As more facts came to light, the public was captivated by the disturbing nature of the crime, which only seemed to raise more questions. Why had Chad Dorman, a man who was supposed to love and protect his children, turned into a cold-blooded murderer? What could possibly have driven him to commit such a horrific act, particularly on the day that should have been filled with joy and celebration? Local news stations broadcasted hourly updates, showing footage of the crime scene, interviews with neighbors, and emotional tributes from the community. The chilling details that began to emerge, his bizarre behavior hours before the killings, the fact that his wife Laura had tried to protect the children but was left injured in the process, were broadcast across screens nationwide. Each detail seemed to make the tragedy even more incomprehensible. One moment, Chad was the father in the background, preparing for a simple family gathering. The next, he was the perpetrator of an unthinkable crime. The media outlets, in their desperate pursuit to understand the why behind the crime, pored over every aspect of Chad's life. His past was examined with a fine-tooth comb, every potential sign of instability, or a breakdown that could explain the horrifying violence. But the deeper the media dug, the more it seemed that there were few answers, only more unsettling questions. In the midst of the media frenzy, the people of Monroe Township tried to make sense of the devastation. Some spoke out. Others remained silent, struggling with grief and disbelief. Memorials for Clayton, Hunter, and Chase were held in the days following the tragedy, giving the community a chance to come together to mourn the loss of 3 young lives taken far too soon. At these memorials, there were tears, but also a quiet anger, a sense of injustice that a father, someone who was meant to be their protector, had taken the lives of his children in the most brutal and senseless way possible. The tributes were filled with sorrow and love, with people sharing their memories of the 3 young boys whose lives had been stolen. Clayton, the eldest, was remembered for his bright smile and infectious laugh. Hunter, the second son, was known for his playful spirit, always making everyone around him laugh. Chase, the youngest, was the innocent little boy whose life had been stolen before he had the chance to experience what every child deserves: joy, love, and a future. As people gathered at memorials and made tributes, the media continued to push for more answers, airing emotional interviews with survivors and law enforcement officials. However, no one seemed to have a concrete explanation for why Chad Dorman had committed such an unspeakable act. Was it a mental health breakdown, a sudden, inexplicable snap of his psyche, or was there something darker, more complex hidden beneath the surface of his seemingly normal life? The community struggled to reconcile these possibilities, but the one thing they could agree on was that there would be no closure for them, not without answers, not without understanding why it happened. The media, of course, had no shortage of theories, but the residents of Monroe Township could not simply move on from the trauma. They were left with a hole in their hearts, an absence that could not be filled by news reports or criminal investigations. The true horror wasn't just the loss of the children, but the realization that a father, a man they had trusted, had been capable of such cruelty. And so, while the story of Chad Dorman's crimes spread across the country, the people of Monroe Township remained trapped in a limbo of grief and confusion. In the wake of such a tragedy, the community struggled to rebuild, haunted by the memory of a day that should have been filled with happiness, but was forever tainted by violence. They were forced to question what it meant to truly know someone, and how easily the mask of normalcy can hide the most unfathomable darkness. The aftermath of Chad Dorman's actions left an entire community in disbelief. A father who should have been a protector turned into a killer, leaving a trail of heartbreak and unanswered questions. The court proceedings that followed were filled with shock and disbelief. Chad, who had once been an ordinary man, stood trial for the brutal execution of his 3 sons. Despite his initial attempts to explain his actions, his motives remained elusive. Was it a sudden burst of rage, a deeply rooted mental illness, or something darker we will never fully understand? Laura Duerman, the sole survivor, now carries the weight of that day, the loss of her children, the trauma of the violence she witnessed, and the overwhelming grief of seeing her family torn apart. The memories of the birthday party that was never held, the cake that never got cut, haunt the community to this day. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of how fragile life can be, how the face of evil can sometimes come from those we trust the most. And while the courts have delivered their verdict, the scars left on the victims, the survivors, and the community will never heal. What happened on that fateful day remains a chilling reminder that darkness can strike when we least expect it, and that sometimes, the most horrifying crimes happen behind closed doors. As the investigation unfolds, questions remain. What led Chad Duerman to commit this horrific crime? Was there a clear warning sign, or did it come without any prior indication of what was to come? The answers might be buried deep within the story of a man who seemed ordinary, but whose actions shattered everything. If you're as stunned as we are by this case, let us know what you think. What do you believe drove him to kill his own children? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you're captivated by this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others who need to hear this shocking tale. Stay tuned for more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.